Racist cop calls black man a monkey. Unaware he is an FBI agent. The midday sun hovered high in the cloudless sky, turning the highway into a shimmering ribbon of heat. Marcus Grant sat behind the wheel of his black sedan, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel. The hum of the tires against the pavement was the only sound in the car, a soothing rhythm as he drove. The tranquil moment was interrupted by the sudden, piercing wail of a siren. In the rearview mirror, red and blue lights flashed, breaking the monotony of the open road. Marcus sighed softly, his expression calm but unreadable. Without hesitation, he turned on his blinker and eased the car onto the shoulder, bringing it to a smooth stop. He shifted into park and rested his hands on the wheel, waiting. The patrol car pulled up behind him, the engine idling loudly. After a moment, the driver's side door opened, and Officer Daniel Wren stepped out. His polished boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, one hand resting on his belt, the other swinging a flashlight he didn't need in broad daylight. His reflective sunglasses hid his eyes, but his smirk was visible beneath his trimmed mustache. Wren stopped a few feet from the driver's side window, surveying the vehicle with a practiced air of authority. The window rolled down, revealing Marcus's composed face. His dark skin gleamed in the sunlight, and his expression was calm, almost indifferent, as if this were just another routine stop. "License and registration," Wren said curtly, his tone leaving no room for pleasantries. Marcus nodded without speaking. He moved deliberately, reaching over to the glove compartment and retrieving the requested documents. His movements were slow, precise, too deliberate for Wren's liking. Marcus handed over the items, leaning back into his seat with the same unbothered demeanor. Wren inspected the license first, flipping it over with his thumb as if searching for flaws. "Marcus Grant," he said aloud, his voice laced with something unspoken. He glanced up at Marcus, then at the registration. Everything seemed to be in order, which annoyed him. "What's the rush, Marcus?" Wren asked, his smirk widening. "You were pushing it back there, going, what, 5 over the limit?" "I wasn't aware I was speeding," Marcus replied evenly, his tone neutral. He didn't offer more than necessary. "Oh, you weren't aware?" Wren echoed mockingly, leaning down so his face was level with the window. "Maybe you weren't paying attention. Happens to people like you sometimes." Marcus's eyes flicked to Wren's face, holding his gaze for a beat longer than most would. "People like me," he repeated, his voice calm but edged with subtle curiosity. Wren straightened up, his smirk fading into something colder. He tapped the roof of the car with his flashlight, a sharp metallic sound that broke the stillness. "Step out of the vehicle." Marcus hesitated for half a second, his hands still resting on the steering wheel. Then, without argument, he opened the door and stepped out. He moved with the same deliberate composure, rising to his full height. Wren hadn't expected him to be so tall. The man's broad shoulders and steady posture made him seem larger than he was, a detail that Wren found irritating. "Turn around and face the car," Wren ordered. Marcus turned slowly, his hands at his sides, his movements unhurried. Wren stepped closer, circling him like a predator sizing up prey. The officer's eyes roamed over Marcus's plain white shirt, his jeans, and his sneakers, looking for anything to criticize. There was nothing remarkable about the man's appearance, but something about his calmness felt wrong, almost defiant. "Where are you coming from?" Wren asked, his voice sharp. "The city," Marcus replied. "And where are you headed?" "Just driving." Wren narrowed his eyes, irritated by the vague answer. "You always this vague, or is it just today?" Marcus turned his head slightly, his expression unchanged. "I didn't realize I was obligated to provide my itinerary, officer." Wren's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way Marcus spoke, polite but firm, as if he were the one in control. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Wren snapped. He stepped closer, deliberately invading Marcus's personal space. "You think this is a game? Talking like you're better than me." "I'm not playing any games," Marcus said evenly. His eyes remained steady, unblinking. "Are you?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Wren took a half step back, his hand hovering near his baton. For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension crackling between them. Another car passed by, slowing briefly as the driver glanced at the scene. Ren turned his head sharply, scowling at the passing vehicle. "Move along," he barked, his voice harsh and authoritative. The car sped up, disappearing over the next hill. When Ren turned back, Marcus was still watching him, his calm expression unbroken. The officer felt a prickle of unease but quickly shook it off. He wasn't about to let this man rattle him. "Stay right there," Ren growled, stepping back toward his patrol car. He reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder, glancing over his shoulder at Marcus as if expecting him to make a move. But Marcus didn't budge. The officer spoke into his radio, his voice clipped and professional. "Routine traffic stop. I'll call if I need backup." As he lowered the radio, Ren's gaze returned to Marcus, who stood quietly by his car, his hands still visible. The man's calmness was starting to feel like a provocation. Ren wasn't sure why, but something about Marcus Grant didn't sit right with him, and he intended to find out what it was. The sun continued its relentless assault, the heat bouncing off the asphalt in shimmering waves. Marcus remained by his car, standing tall and unmoving. The distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of insects were the only sounds, punctuated by the crackle of static from Officer Ren's radio. Ren walked back toward Marcus, his hand still resting on his belt. His sunglasses reflected Marcus's stoic face, hiding the irritation simmering in his own. He hadn't found anything in the man's documents, and the calm demeanor of his detainee was gnawing at his nerves. "So, Marcus," Ren began, his tone condescending, "what's got you out here in the middle of nowhere? Seems like an odd place for a city guy like you." "I enjoy the open road," Marcus replied simply, his voice measured and calm. Ren snorted, shaking his head as if he found the answer amusing. "The open road, huh? That what you city folks call it these days?" He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. "Tell me, Marcus, you got anything in that car I should know about?" Marcus's eyes didn't waver. "No, officer. Nothing illegal, if that's what you're implying." Ren tilted his head, studying him. "You seem awful confident for someone pulled over. Most people get nervous when I ask questions like that." "I have nothing to hide," Marcus replied. His tone was even, but there was a firmness to his words that made Ren pause. The officer straightened, his jaw tightening. He glanced toward the car, then back at Marcus. "Mind if I take a look? Just to be sure you're telling the truth." Marcus's lips pressed into a thin line. He took a deep breath before answering. "I'm not sure that's necessary, officer. You've already seen my documents, and I don't believe I've given you cause to search my vehicle." Ren's eyes narrowed behind his sunglasses. "Are you refusing, Marcus?" His voice was low, dangerous, meant to intimidate. "I'm simply exercising my rights," Marcus replied, his voice unshaken. "Is there a reason you think a search is necessary?" For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them crackling like electricity. Ren's hand twitched near his baton, but he didn't reach for it. Instead, he took a step closer, invading Marcus's space. "You're awfully brave for someone in your position," Ren muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd be careful if I were you. People like you don't usually walk away from situations like this unscathed." Marcus's gaze hardened, his composure unshaken. "People like me? And what kind of people would that be, officer?" Ren smirked, but his lips trembled ever so slightly. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, the sound of a car engine interrupted him. Both men turned to see a small blue sedan slowing down as it passed. The driver, a young woman with curly hair and wide eyes, glanced at the scene with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The woman held up her phone, clearly recording the encounter. Ren's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a scowl. He raised his hand, waving aggressively at the car. "Move along," he barked, his voice carrying across the road. The woman hesitated for a moment before stepping on the gas, her car disappearing over the hill. Ren turned back to Marcus, his face flushed with anger. "Great," Ren muttered under his breath. Now we've got an audience. Hope you're happy, Marcus. I didn't invite her, Marcus replied smoothly. But maybe she saw something worth recording. Ren's face darkened, his lips curling into a sneer. Don't get smart with me, boy. His voice was cold, dripping with venom. Marcus didn't flinch. I'm not trying to be smart, officer. Just stating the facts. Ren took another step closer, his finger jabbing toward Marcus's chest but stopping just short of contact. Listen here. You think you're clever? You think you can talk your way out of this? I've dealt with plenty like you before. Arrogant, full of themselves, thinking they're untouchable. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his calm expression unwavering. And how did that work out for you, officer? The question landed like a slap. Ren's face turned red, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, it seemed as though he might lash out, but then his radio crackled to life. Unit 47, status check, a voice said over the airwaves. Ren exhaled sharply, raising the radio to his mouth. His voice was tight as he responded. Routine traffic stop. Nothing to report. As he lowered the radio, Ren glanced back at Marcus, his jaw tightening. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The tension hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and oppressive. Marcus remained standing by his car, his posture relaxed but unyielding. Ren paced in a tight circle, his boots crunching against the gravel. The radio on his shoulder crackled faintly, but no new instructions came through. The highway was quiet again, the only sound the faint rustle of dry grass swaying in the breeze. Marcus's calm demeanor seemed to taunt Ren, who couldn't shake the feeling that he was being underestimated, or worse, mocked. Ren stopped pacing and fixed Marcus with a glare. Stay right here, he growled, pointing a finger for emphasis. Without waiting for a response, he turned and strode back to his patrol car. Inside the car, Ren yanked open the door and dropped into the driver's seat. He reached for his in-car computer, typing Marcus Grant's information into the system with more force than necessary. His fingers danced over the keys, searching for anything. Outstanding warrants, prior arrests, even a parking ticket. But the screen returned nothing. Clean, Ren muttered under his breath, his jaw tightening. Too clean. He glanced up through the windshield, his gaze landing on Marcus, who was still standing by his car, his hands in plain sight. Ren grabbed his radio. Dispatch. This is Unit 47. Requesting a secondary unit for a traffic stop. Possible resistance. The voice on the other end crackled back. Acknowledged. Unit 47. Backup is en route. Satisfied, Ren replaced the radio and leaned back in his seat, his mind racing. Something about this man didn't add up, and Ren hated loose ends. He wasn't about to let Marcus walk away without proving he was in control. Back outside, Marcus shifted his weight slightly, glancing toward the horizon. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the road. He noticed a car parked farther up the highway, partially obscured by a cluster of bushes. The car was unmarked, its dark windows reflecting the golden light. Marcus's eyes lingered on it for a moment before returning to the patrol car behind him. Ren emerged from his car, his expression hard. He walked toward Marcus, stopping a few feet away. Backup's on the way, he said, his tone sharp. So if there's anything you want to tell me before they get here, now's your chance. Marcus raised an eyebrow. I've already answered your questions, officer. I'm not sure what else you're looking for. Ren's lips twisted into a sneer. You think you're clever, don't you? Playing it cool, acting like you've got nothing to hide. I have nothing to hide, Marcus said evenly. Before Ren could respond, the sound of a car engine drew their attention. Both men turned to see the same blue sedan from earlier, the one driven by the young woman who had recorded the encounter. The car slowed as it approached, and this time, it pulled to a stop on the shoulder a few yards away. The woman stepped out, her phone in hand. She was petite, with curly brown hair tied back in a loose ponytail. Her expression was a mix of concern and determination. Ren's face darkened. Ma'am, I need you to get back in your vehicle and leave the area. This is a police matter. The woman hesitated, her grip on her phone tightening. "I'm just here to make sure everything's okay," she said, her voice steady but cautious. "Everything is fine," Ren snapped. "Move along before you interfere with an active investigation." Marcus's gaze shifted to the woman, his face still calm but his eyes sharp. She met his gaze briefly, as if seeking reassurance. Then she lifted her phone and pressed the record button. Ren took a step toward her, his hands clenched into fists. "I said, leave. Now." The woman didn't budge. "I'm on public property," she said, her voice gaining confidence. "And I have the right to record. I'm not interfering." Ren's face turned red, his anger barely contained. "You think this is some kind of game? You don't know what you're getting yourself into." Marcus finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "She's not breaking any laws, officer. Let her be." Ren spun around, his eyes blazing. "Stay out of this, Grant. You're already in enough trouble." "Trouble for what?" Marcus asked, his tone unshaken. "Driving 5 miles over the speed limit? Or for standing up for myself?" The question hung in the air, cutting through the tension like a blade. The woman continued recording, her phone steady despite the obvious risk. Ren glared at both of them, his breathing heavy. Before anyone could say more, the sound of another car approaching drew their attention. This time, it was a patrol car, its lights flashing as it pulled up behind Ren's vehicle. A second officer stepped out, younger and visibly nervous. He glanced at Ren, then at Marcus, and finally at the woman with the phone. "What's going on here?" the new officer asked, his voice shaky. Ren turned to him, his expression hard. "Routine stop. This guy's being uncooperative, and she won't leave." The younger officer looked uncertain, his eyes darting between the three figures. He seemed hesitant, as if unsure of how to proceed. The woman lowered her phone slightly, her voice breaking the silence. "I'm just making sure no one gets hurt. That's all." Marcus stayed silent, his eyes steady on Ren. The tension in the air was palpable, like the calm before a storm. And the storm was just beginning. The highway was now a tableau of uneasy stillness, disrupted only by the faint hum of the second patrol car's idling engine. Marcus remained by his sedan, calm and composed, his gaze briefly sweeping across the new officer who had just arrived. The young cop looked unsure, his hand resting on his belt but not reaching for his weapon. He seemed to sense that something was off, though he couldn't put his finger on it. Ren, on the other hand, was a storm barely contained. His jaw clenched as he paced between Marcus, the woman with the phone, and the new officer. The presence of the camera seemed to stoke his frustration, but he refrained from making any rash moves, for now. "This situation is under control," Ren barked at the younger officer. "Just stay back and let me handle it." The young officer hesitated but nodded, taking a few steps back. His eyes lingered on Marcus, then darted to the woman with the phone. The uncertainty in his expression was clear. Meanwhile, Marcus's calm facade hadn't wavered, but his eyes carried a glint of quiet observation. He glanced at the second patrol car, then subtly scanned the road ahead and behind, as though mentally mapping the scene. His movements were almost imperceptible, yet deliberate. Ren's attention snapped back to Marcus. "All right, let's cut the act. What are you really doing out here, huh? Who are you meeting? What are you hiding?" Marcus's lips curved slightly, just enough to suggest the faintest of smiles. "Officer, I've told you everything you need to know. If you're looking for something else, I'm afraid you're wasting your time." "Wasting my time?" Ren repeated, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think this is a joke? I could have your car towed, your license suspended. Hell, I could make your life a living nightmare." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Why would you want to do that, officer? For a traffic stop?" The question landed like a challenge. Ren stepped closer, his finger jabbing toward Marcus's chest but stopping just short. The proximity was meant to intimidate, but Marcus didn't flinch. "Because people like you think you can get away with anything," Ren hissed, his voice low and venomous. Before Marcus could respond, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Ren noticed the slight movement and barked, "Don't even think about it." Marcus paused, his hand halfway to his pocket. "It's just a call, officer. I said don't touch it." Ren snapped, his hand hovering near his baton. Marcus raised both hands slightly, palms up, a gesture of compliance. The phone continued to vibrate, then fell silent. A few moments later, it buzzed again, this time longer, as if signaling a message or voicemail. The woman recording spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. "He has the right to answer his phone. You can't stop him from doing that." Ren spun around, his glare silencing her briefly. "I don't need advice from some nosy bystander. Now get in your car and leave before I charge you with obstruction." She didn't move, her phone still aimed at him. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her tone firmer than before. "I'm just here to make sure everything's recorded." Ren turned back to Marcus, his temper barely restrained. He reached out and patted Marcus's pockets roughly, ostensibly searching for weapons. His movements were quick and aggressive, but his hands stopped when they brushed against something small and flat. "What's this?" Ren demanded, pulling a sleek black card holder from Marcus's pocket. He flipped it open, revealing nothing more than a few neatly arranged credit cards and an ID. His eyes scanned the ID, his expression twisting into confusion. The ID was blank except for Marcus's name, his photo, and a faint holographic emblem that seemed official but unfamiliar. Ren stared at it, the furrow in his brow deepening. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, holding the card up to the light. Marcus didn't respond. His silence, combined with the faint trace of a smile on his lips, seemed to unnerve Ren further. Before Ren could press further, the distant rumble of an engine drew everyone's attention. A dark SUV, sleek and unmarked, approached from the horizon, its windows tinted black. It slowed as it neared the scene, finally pulling to a stop a few yards away. The doors remained closed, the engine idling. Ren froze, his instincts kicking in. Something about the vehicle felt out of place. He turned to the young officer, who looked equally uneasy. "Did you call for that?" Ren barked. The younger officer shook his head quickly. "No, sir. I only called for backup." The woman with the phone lowered her camera slightly, her expression shifting from defiance to curiosity. Even Marcus turned his head slightly toward the SUV, his calm demeanor giving way to the faintest hint of interest. The SUV's engine cut off, and the driver's door opened slowly. A man in a dark suit stepped out, his face obscured by sunglasses and a neutral expression. He surveyed the scene, his movements deliberate but unhurried. "What now?" Ren muttered under his breath, his hand tightening on his belt. The man in the suit closed the SUV's door and began walking toward them, his footsteps steady on the gravel. Every eye was on him, the air thick with anticipation. He stopped a few feet away, his gaze settling on Marcus. "Mr. Grant," the man said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Everything all right here?" Marcus smiled faintly, his eyes meeting the man's. For the first time since the stop began, Marcus spoke with a tone that carried a subtle weight. "It is now," he said. Ren's eyes darted between Marcus and the man in the suit. Confusion and suspicion etched into his features. The woman with the phone resumed recording, sensing that the situation was about to take another turn. And just like that, the dynamic of the encounter began to shift. The quiet hum of the unmarked SUV's engine had faded, but its presence loomed over the scene like a storm cloud. Ren's body tensed, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. The man in the dark suit stood with an air of authority that demanded attention, though he said nothing more after addressing Marcus. "Who are you?" Ren finally asked, his voice edged with irritation and suspicion. He squared his shoulders, attempting to reassert control over the situation. The man turned slowly, removing his sunglasses with deliberate precision. His gaze was sharp, his expression unreadable. "I don't believe I owe you an explanation, officer," he said coolly. "I'm here to ensure this situation doesn't escalate unnecessarily." Ren's face flushed, his grip tightening on his belt. "This is a routine traffic stop. I don't need interference from," he gestured vaguely toward the SUV, his frustration clear, "whoever you are." The man raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unshaken. A routine stop? He glanced at Marcus briefly before returning his gaze to Ren. It doesn't look routine to me. Ren opened his mouth to retort, but before he could, the passenger door of the SUV opened, and another figure stepped out. This time, it was a woman dressed in business attire, her posture stiff and professional. She carried a sleek leather folder tucked under one arm and moved with the same measured confidence as the man. She approached silently, her sharp eyes scanning the scene. When she reached the man in the suit, she leaned in and whispered something inaudible. He nodded once, then turned back to Ren. "Officer Ren, is it?" the man asked, his tone neutral. Ren blinked, surprised. "Yeah, that's me. What's it to you?" The man tilted his head slightly, as if considering his response. "I'd advise you to tread carefully. You might not fully understand the situation you found yourself in." Ren's frustration boiled over. "Listen, I don't know who you think you are, but I'm the one in charge here. You can't just show up and—" The woman interrupted him, her voice cutting cleanly through his tirade. "This is no longer your jurisdiction, officer." The statement landed like a blow. Ren's face darkened, and his jaw tightened. What the hell is that supposed to mean? The man in the suit stepped forward, closing the distance between them. His calm exterior had shifted slightly, a subtle but unmistakable edge creeping into his tone. "It means you should step back, stay quiet, and let us handle this. Unless, of course, you'd like to explain your actions to a higher authority later." Ren faltered for a moment, his confidence cracking. The younger officer, who had been watching the exchange in silence, took a small step back, clearly uncomfortable. Meanwhile, Marcus remained by his car, watching the interaction with quiet interest. His expression gave nothing away, but there was a faint glint in his eye, as though he were waiting for something. The woman with the phone, still recording, shifted her position slightly to capture the new arrivals more clearly. Her presence seemed to bother no one except Ren, whose glare flicked toward her briefly before snapping back to the man in the suit. "You can't just barge in here and take over," Ren said, his voice rising. "I have every right to conduct this stop, and until I'm told otherwise." The woman in business attire held up her hand, cutting him off mid-sentence. She opened the leather folder and produced a slim document, holding it out for Ren to see. "This is your notification," she said curtly. "The situation now falls under federal jurisdiction. You are instructed to stand down immediately." Ren stared at the document, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The emblem at the top of the page was unmistakable, the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal jurisdiction? Ren sputtered. For what? This guy was speeding. The man in the suit turned to Marcus, his expression softening slightly. "Are you all right, Mr. Grant?" Marcus nodded, his voice calm. "I'm fine. Thank you." The exchange seemed simple enough, but to Ren, it was a gut punch. He felt the control he'd clung to slipping away, the scene unraveling before his eyes. He looked back at the woman with the folder, then at the man in the suit, and finally at Marcus. "Who the hell are you?" Ren demanded, his voice cracking slightly. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a step closer, his posture as steady and composed as ever. For the first time, he allowed a faint smile to cross his lips. "Just a man trying to get home," Marcus said quietly. The simplicity of the response infuriated Ren, but before he could say another word, the man in the suit raised his hand. "That's enough," he said firmly. "Officer Ren, your role here is finished. I suggest you return to your vehicle and wait for further instructions." Ren hesitated, his pride warring with his better judgment. Finally, he took a step back, his hands balled into fists at his sides. He glanced at Marcus one last time, his eyes filled with barely concealed rage, before storming back to his patrol car. The younger officer lingered for a moment, his gaze flitting nervously between Ren and the agents. Then he followed, disappearing into his car without a word. As the patrol cars idled, the woman with the folder approached Marcus, her tone professional but polite. "We'll escort you the rest of the way, Mr. Grant." Let's ensure there are no further complications. Marcus nodded, stepping toward the SUV. The man in the suit opened the door for him, and he climbed inside without looking back. As the SUV's engine roared to life, the woman with the phone lowered her camera, her expression a mix of relief and curiosity. She stood by her car, watching as the sleek vehicle pulled onto the highway and disappeared into the horizon. Back in his patrol car, Ren sat fuming, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. His radio crackled, but he didn't respond. The question burned in his mind. Who the hell was that man? The unmarked SUV sped down the highway, its dark windows concealing its occupants from the outside world. Inside, Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his posture relaxed but his eyes focused. The man in the suit drove with steady precision, while the woman in business attire sat in the passenger seat, her folder now closed and resting on her lap. After a few minutes of silence, the woman turned slightly, glancing at Marcus. Her tone was professional but carried a hint of concern. "Are you sure you want to proceed as planned, Mr. Grant? Things could have escalated back there." Marcus met her gaze in the rearview mirror. "Yes, I'm sure. Let them stew for a bit. We've got what we need." The man in the suit glanced at Marcus through the rearview mirror but said nothing. His hands remained steady on the wheel as the SUV merged onto a quieter road, leaving the highway behind. Back at the scene, Officer Ren slammed his fist against the dashboard of his patrol car. The younger officer, sitting uneasily in the passenger seat, flinched at the sudden outburst. "What the hell just happened?" Ren growled, his voice low but seething with anger. "Who do they think they are, waltzing in here like they own the place?" The younger officer hesitated before responding. "Sir, maybe we should report this. It doesn't feel right." Ren shot him a withering glare. "Report it? To who?" "They're feds. You think anyone's going to back us up against them?" The younger officer didn't respond, his gaze shifting to the now empty road ahead. The tension in the car was palpable, the air thick with unspoken questions. After a moment, Ren grabbed his radio and barked into it. "Dispatch. This is Unit 47. I need a full run on a Marcus Grant. Cross-reference with anything federal." There was a pause on the other end before the dispatcher responded. "Copy that. Unit 47. Stand by." Ren leaned back in his seat, his jaw tightening as he stared out the windshield. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just been played, and the thought burned in his gut. Meanwhile, the woman with the phone had pulled off the road a short distance away. She sat in her car, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the footage she had captured. The confrontation, the arrival of the SUV, the tension, it was all there, playing out on her screen like a scene from a movie. She hesitated for a moment before opening her social media app. Her fingers hovered over the upload button as she debated what to do. She knew the video would spark a firestorm of reactions, but was she ready for the backlash that might come with it? Taking a deep breath, she hit upload. The caption read, "Caught this on the highway today. Something isn't right. #justice #accountability." Within minutes, notifications began flooding in. Comments, likes, and shares piled up as the video started to spread. At a nondescript government building miles away, a phone buzzed on a polished desk. A man in a tailored suit glanced at the screen, his expression shifting slightly as he read the alert. He picked up the phone and scrolled through the video, his eyes narrowing as he watched. Without looking up, he pressed a button on his desk phone. "Get me Director Hayes. Tell him it's about the Grant situation." The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and Marcus's calm exit from the scene was only the beginning. Back in the SUV, the silence was interrupted by a phone vibrating on the dashboard. The man in the suit glanced at it briefly before handing it to the woman. She answered with a crisp, "This is Agent Rourke." The voice on the other end was calm but firm. "The video's already online. It's gaining traction fast. We need to contain this before it spirals." Agent Rourke glanced at Marcus, who was staring out the window. "Understood," she said. "We'll make sure it doesn't escalate further." She ended the call and turned to Marcus. "Your move, Mr. Grant. How do you want to handle this?" Marcus didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. After a moment, he spoke, his voice steady. "Let them talk. The more noise they make, the easier it'll be to see who's really paying attention." The man in the suit smirked faintly but kept his eyes on the road. The SUV continued its journey, leaving behind a trail of questions, doubts, and a storm brewing on the horizon. The day had dragged into the late afternoon, but the tension surrounding Officer Wren felt as sharp as ever. Seated in his patrol car, he drummed his fingers against the steering wheel, waiting for a response from dispatch. The younger officer sat silently beside him, occasionally stealing glances at Wren's clenched jaw and furrowed brow. Finally, the radio crackled. "Unit 47, this is dispatch. We've got a preliminary run on Marcus Grant, but there's nothing significant on record. However..." Wren leaned forward, his grip tightening on the radio. "Go on," he urged. "There's a restricted federal flag on the name. No additional information available from our system." Wren's face twisted with frustration. "What the hell does that mean? Restricted? It means you're poking where you shouldn't be," the dispatcher replied, her tone cautious. "You might want to drop this one, Wren. It's above your pay grade." The radio clicked off, leaving Wren fuming. He slammed his fist against the dashboard, muttering a string of curses. The younger officer flinched but said nothing. "Restricted," Wren repeated under his breath, his eyes narrowing. "There's no way this guy's clean. He's hiding something." The younger officer shifted uneasily. "Maybe we should just let it go, sir. If the feds are involved, it's probably best not to push it." Wren snapped his head toward him, his glare icy. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about letting it go. This is about respect. That guy thinks he can walk all over me, like I'm nobody. I'm not letting him get away with that." The younger officer didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention to the road, hoping the silence would cool Wren's temper. Meanwhile, the video from the woman's phone was rapidly gaining traction online. It had already been shared thousands of times, sparking a heated debate in the comments. Some condemned the officer's behavior, while others questioned the man's calm demeanor, suggesting he might have something to hide. Among those watching was a reporter at a small but respected news outlet. She sat at her desk, scrolling through the footage with growing interest. Her eyes lingered on the moment when the unmarked SUV arrived and the suited agents took control. "This doesn't add up," she murmured, grabbing her notebook. With a few quick keystrokes, she began searching for information on Marcus Grant. Like Wren, she found nothing but an ordinary driver's license record, until she stumbled upon a buried press release from years ago. It was brief, almost forgotten, but it carried a name: Marcus Grant, Special Agent, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her eyes widened. "No way," she whispered, quickly jotting down notes. Inside the SUV, Marcus remained silent as the vehicle weaved through quieter roads. The agents up front exchanged occasional glances, but neither spoke until Agent Rourke finally broke the silence. "The video's everywhere now," she said, scrolling through her phone. "It won't be long before someone makes the connection." Marcus glanced at her reflection in the rear-view mirror. "Let them." Rourke raised an eyebrow. "You're sure? It could complicate the mission." "The mission's already complicated," Marcus replied evenly. "And I didn't ask for the video, but it might work in our favor." Agent Rourke hesitated, then nodded. She exchanged a look with the driver, who simply shrugged. "What's next?" the driver asked. Marcus's gaze shifted out the window, his expression unreadable. "We wait. Let the pieces fall where they may." Back at the police station, Wren stormed into the locker room, his face red with anger. He tossed his hat onto the bench and sat down heavily, running his hands through his hair. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been humiliated, and the restricted flag on Marcus's name only added fuel to the fire. The door creaked open, and the precinct captain stepped in, his face stern. "Wren, my office." "Now." Wren looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What's this about?" The captain didn't answer, simply turning and walking away. Wren muttered under his breath, but followed. When he entered the office, the door closed behind him with a sharp click. The captain gestured for him to sit, his expression grim. "What happened out there today?" the captain asked, leaning against his desk. "What do you mean?" Ren replied defensively. "It was a routine stop. That guy, Grant, he was acting suspicious. I did my job." The captain's eyes darkened. "Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not escalate situations unnecessarily. And now I've got federal agents breathing down my neck, asking questions about you." Ren blinked, his mouth opening but no words coming out. "Who is Marcus Grant?" the captain asked sharply. "Do you even know who you were dealing with?" "No," Ren admitted. "But there's something off about him. He's hiding something." The captain leaned in, his voice low. "What he's hiding, or not hiding, is none of your concern. What is your concern is how you handled that stop. The video's gone viral. Ren, this department doesn't need the heat." "The video?" Ren exclaimed. "What video?" The captain didn't answer. Instead, he turned his computer screen toward Ren, pressing play. The footage from the woman's phone filled the screen, showing every tense moment of the encounter, from Ren's aggressive questioning to the arrival of the SUV. Ren's face turned pale. That's not the whole story." "It doesn't matter," the captain snapped. "What matters is perception. And right now, the perception is that you're a loose cannon." Ren clenched his fists, his anger boiling beneath the surface. "What are you going to do?" The captain's expression hardened. "For now, I'm suspending you. Pending an investigation." Ren shot to his feet. "You can't be serious." "This isn't up for debate," the captain said coldly. "Turn in your badge and gun." Ren stood frozen for a moment before finally pulling his badge and service weapon from his belt. He placed them on the desk with a sharp clink, his jaw tight. As he stormed out of the office, his thoughts were racing. He wasn't going to let this end here. Not without answers. The dimly lit parking lot outside the precinct was a stark contrast to the blazing sun of earlier. Ren stood next to his patrol car, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His badge and gun were gone, and with them, the authority he had relied on for years. He paced in tight circles, his mind replaying the events of the day over and over. Every moment, every word Marcus had spoken, felt like a puzzle piece that refused to fit. Restricted, Ren muttered under his breath. Federal agents. Viral videos. What the hell is going on? A sudden voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "Ren." He turned sharply to see the younger officer standing a few feet away, shifting nervously. He held out a small folded piece of paper. "You're going to want to see this," the officer said, his voice low. Ren snatched the paper and unfolded it. His eyes scanned the neatly printed words. A name, an address, and a note that read, "If you want answers, start here." Ren's eyes narrowed. "Where did you get this?" The younger officer hesitated. "It was left at the front desk, addressed to you. I don't know who dropped it off." Ren stared at the note for a long moment before shoving it into his pocket. Without another word, he walked briskly to his personal car, the gravel crunching under his boots. Whatever this was, he wasn't going to let it go. Across town, in a quiet corner of a high-rise office building, Marcus stood by a large window, looking out at the city below. The view was stunning, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Behind him, Agent Rourke entered the room, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. "It's starting to unravel," she said, holding a tablet that displayed the now viral video. "Public sentiment is shifting. Some are defending the officer, but most are questioning his conduct, and yours." Marcus turned, his expression unreadable. "Good. Let them question. It forces them to pay attention." Rourke frowned slightly, setting the tablet on a nearby desk. "The higher-ups are asking if you're taking this too far. They're worried about exposure." "Exposure," Marcus repeated, his tone cool. "The system thrives in the dark. Exposure is the only way to fix it." Rourke crossed her arms. "You're playing with fire, Marcus. Ren isn't going to back down. He's got nothing to lose now, and that makes him dangerous." "Dangerous to himself," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "Not to me." Rourke sighed, shaking her head. "Just remember, this isn't just about you. There are bigger implications if this spirals out of control." Marcus's gaze softened, but his resolve remained. "I know. But sometimes you need to create chaos to find the truth." That evening, Ren sat in his car outside the address on the note. It was a small, unassuming house in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place that wouldn't draw attention. The porch light was on, casting a soft glow over the front steps. Ren hesitated, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Something about this felt off, but his frustration and curiosity pushed him forward. He stepped out of the car and approached the door, his boots crunching against the gravel walkway. He knocked twice, his knuckles striking the wood sharply. A long pause followed before the door creaked open slightly. A woman in her late 50s peeked out, her eyes wary. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. Ren cleared his throat. "I'm here about Marcus Grant. Does that name mean anything to you?" The woman's expression shifted instantly. Recognition, then apprehension. She opened the door wider, motioning for him to step inside. "You'd better come in." Inside, the house was modest but tidy. The woman gestured for Ren to sit at the small kitchen table. She poured herself a glass of water, her hands trembling slightly, then sat across from him. "How do you know Marcus?" she asked, her voice tight. "I don't," Ren admitted. "Not really. He was part of a traffic stop I conducted earlier today. Things escalated." The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. "And you're here because you think there's more to him than meets the eye?" Ren nodded. "You know something, don't you? Who is he, really?" She hesitated, her fingers gripping the glass tightly. "Marcus Grant. Used to be a regular guy. A teacher, actually. He loved his students, worked hard, never caused trouble. But then..." Her voice trailed off, and she looked away. "Then what?" Ren pressed, leaning forward. The woman took a deep breath. "Then he joined the bureau. After his brother was killed." Ren's brow furrowed. "Killed? How?" Her eyes darkened. "Police brutality. An officer claimed he felt threatened. No charges were filed." The words hit Ren like a punch to the gut. He leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. "So, he became an agent to get justice?" "Something like that," the woman said quietly. "But Marcus doesn't just seek justice. He exposes the rot in the system. And he's relentless. If he's crossed your path, officer, you should tread carefully. He doesn't stop until the truth comes out." Ren stared at her, his thoughts racing. For the first time, he felt a flicker of doubt, not just about Marcus, but about himself. "Where is he now?" Ren asked, his voice quieter than before. The woman shook her head. "If Marcus doesn't want to be found, you won't find him. But if he left a trail for you to follow, it means he wants you to see something. The question is, are you ready for it?" The question lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. Ren didn't respond. He simply stood, nodded curtly, and left the house, his mind more conflicted than ever. As Ren drove away, Marcus stood by another window in a different part of the city, watching the skyline. A faint smile played on his lips. The first domino had fallen. The drive back to his apartment was silent, the faint hum of the tires on asphalt the only sound accompanying Ren. His mind churned with conflicting thoughts, each one colliding with the next. Marcus Grant was no ordinary man, that much was clear now. But what unsettled Ren the most wasn't the revelation of Marcus's connection to the FBI or his tragic past. It was the gnawing realization that Marcus had orchestrated every moment of their encounter. This wasn't a coincidence. It was deliberate. Ren parked his car outside his apartment complex, the engine sputtering to a stop. The dim glow of the streetlights cast long shadows across the lot. He sat motionless for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel. The woman's words echoed in his mind. "If he left a trail for you to follow, it means he wants you to see something." The question that lingered was, what? Across the city, Marcus stood in a room dimly lit by the glow of multiple computer screens. A digital map of the precinct filled one monitor, while another displayed a social media feed with thousands of comments on the viral video. Next to him, Agent Rourke leaned against a desk, her arms crossed. "He's going to follow it," she said, her tone confident. Marcus didn't look away from the screens. "Of course he will. Wren's too proud not to." Rourke frowned slightly. "But do you really think he'll see what you want him to?" "He's not exactly open-minded." "He doesn't need to be," Marcus replied, his voice calm. "All I need is for him to reach the next step. After that, the system will do the rest." Rourke pushed off the desk and walked over to Marcus. "And if he doesn't?" Marcus finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "He will." Later that night, Wren sat at his kitchen table, the address from the note still crumpled in his hand. The house he'd visited had given him answers, but not enough. He felt like a pawn in someone else's game, and it enraged him. He needed control. Determined, he opened his laptop and began digging. He searched for Marcus Grant's name again, but the same dead ends greeted him. Frustrated, he started piecing together what little information he had: the restricted federal flag, the unmarked SUV, and the mention of Marcus's brother. Finally, he stumbled upon an old news article buried deep in a local archive. The headline read, "Community teacher mourns brother killed in controversial police incident." The photo showed a younger Marcus standing beside his brother, both smiling. Wren stared at the image, his eyes lingering on Marcus's face. The grief behind the smile was palpable, even through the screen. The article detailed how Marcus's brother, Elijah Grant, had been stopped by police under suspicion of a robbery. The interaction escalated, and Elijah was shot and killed. The officers involved were cleared of wrongdoing. The family had protested, but their voices were drowned out by bureaucratic indifference. "So this is where it started," Wren muttered, leaning back in his chair. But one detail in the article caught his attention: a name. The lead officer in the Elijah Grant case was none other than Captain Joseph Barrett, Wren's current precinct captain. The revelation hit Wren like a freight train. His chest tightened as realization set in. This wasn't just about Marcus. It was about the entire system, and he was smack in the middle of it. At the precinct, Captain Barrett sat in his office, staring at his computer screen. A secure email had just arrived, marked urgent. It contained a link to the viral video and a single line of text: "The past doesn't stay buried forever." Barrett's face paled as he clicked the link. The video played out in front of him, every second driving a spike of unease into his chest. He recognized Marcus instantly, though he hadn't seen him in years. And now, it was clear Marcus wasn't just here by chance. Barrett leaned back in his chair, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for his phone. He dialed a number and waited. "It's me," he said when the line connected. "We have a problem." Meanwhile, Wren's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, expecting another mundane notification, but his breath caught when he saw the message. It was from an unknown number. The message read, "You're closer than you think. Are you ready to learn the truth?" Beneath it was a set of coordinates. Wren stared at the screen, his heart pounding. He knew it was a trap. It had to be. But his curiosity, and his pride, refused to let him walk away. "Fine," he muttered, grabbing his keys. "Let's see what this is all about." The coordinates led him to an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. The structure loomed in the moonlight, its broken windows and rusted walls giving it an air of foreboding. Wren parked his car and stepped out, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun that was no longer there. He cursed under his breath, feeling vulnerable for the first time in years. He approached the entrance cautiously, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The large metal door creaked as he pushed it open, revealing a dark interior faintly illuminated by a single overhead light. In the center of the room was a table. On it sat a laptop, its screen glowing softly. Wren approached it slowly, his senses on high alert. The laptop displayed a single video file labeled "Play Me." He hesitated, glancing around the room, but there was no one else in sight. Gritting his teeth, he hit the play button. The video began with footage of Elijah Grant's final moments, captured by a witness's shaky phone camera. Wren watched as the familiar figure of Captain Barrett appeared on screen, barking orders. The officer's actions were chaotic, aggressive, and ultimately fatal. The sound of a gunshot echoed through the video, and Wren flinched. The screen faded to black, replaced by text. This is where it started. Now it's your turn to decide where it ends. Beneath the text was a timestamp and location, another breadcrumb. Wren stepped back, his mind racing. He had a choice to make. Continue down the rabbit hole or turn back and try to salvage what was left of his life. But deep down, he already knew there was no turning back. The warehouse was suffocatingly quiet, the glow of the laptop screen fading into darkness as Wren stepped back, his breathing uneven. The video replayed in his mind like a haunting specter, Elijah Grant's final moments, Captain Barrett's commanding presence, and the chaotic scene that had ended in tragedy. It was too much to ignore, and yet Wren felt the crushing weight of his own complicity in a system that had allowed this to happen. He gritted his teeth, fists clenched at his sides. The timestamp and location left on the screen were seared into his memory. He didn't know what awaited him there, but he was done playing by someone else's rules. If Marcus Grant wanted him to see the truth, Wren intended to face it on his own terms. The location was an old municipal courthouse, long abandoned and scheduled for demolition. The once grand building was now a crumbling relic of the past, its windows shattered, and its walls stained with graffiti. Wren arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the structure in an eerie orange glow. He parked his car a block away and approached on foot, his every step cautious. The faint crunch of gravel under his boots was the only sound in the stillness. He reached the entrance, a pair of heavy wooden doors slightly ajar. Pushing one open, he stepped inside, his eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The interior was a ghost of its former self, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. Broken benches and scattered debris littered the floor. At the far end of the room, a single light illuminated a podium. On it rested a manila folder and a small recorder. Wren's heartbeat quickened as he approached. He hesitated for a moment before picking up the folder. Inside were photographs, some he recognized from the video of Elijah Grant's death, others that were new. Images of meetings, documents with signatures, and names he didn't know but suspected he should. At the bottom of the stack was a memo stamped with the precinct's letterhead. It outlined an internal complaint filed years ago, alleging misconduct in the Elijah Grant case. The complaint had been marked as resolved, though the resolution field was suspiciously blank. They buried it, Wren muttered, his voice thick with disgust. He set the photos aside and pressed play on the recorder. A man's voice filled the room, steady, deliberate, and unmistakably Marcus Grant's. "Officer Wren," the recording began. "If you're hearing this, then you've decided to keep digging. Good. That means you're not entirely lost yet." Wren's jaw tightened. The voice continued. "What you're holding is only part of the story. My brother wasn't just a victim of bad policing. He was a casualty of a system designed to protect itself at all costs. Every complaint filed against the officers involved was dismissed. Every witness silenced. And the man responsible for covering it all up is the same one who handed you your badge." Wren froze, the weight of the implication hitting him like a freight train. "Captain Barrett knew," Marcus's voice said. "He didn't just turn a blind eye. He made sure no one could hold them accountable. And now, he's still sitting at the top, pretending to uphold justice while hiding the rot beneath." The recording paused for a moment, then continued, the tone sharper. "You have a choice, Wren. You can walk away now, pretend you didn't see any of this. Or you can do what your captain never did. Stand up for what's right. But know this, the path forward won't be easy. You'll face the same system that protected them, the same barriers that I've spent years fighting. The question is, are you ready to face it?" The recording clicked off, leaving Wren in silence once more. Back at the precinct, Captain Barrett paced in his office, his phone pressed to his ear. His face was pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead. "I don't care what you have to do," he barked. "Find Marcus Grant. Shut this down before it goes any further." The voice on the other end offered hesitant assurances, but Barrett wasn't convinced. He slammed the phone down, his breathing ragged. This wasn't just a loose end. It was a ticking time bomb. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He straightened, forcing composure. "Come in." The door opened, and the younger officer from earlier stepped inside. He hesitated, clutching a folder in his hands. "Sir, there's something you should see." Barrett's eyes narrowed as he took the folder. The first photo inside made his blood run cold. It was of him, shaking hands with one of the officers involved in the Elijah Grant case, the caption reading, "Justice or collusion? Where did you get this?" Barrett demanded. The officer shifted nervously. "It was left on my desk this evening. I don't know who." "Get out," Barrett snapped, slamming the folder shut. The officer retreated quickly, leaving Barrett alone with his mounting paranoia. Wren sat in his car outside the courthouse, staring at the photos and memos spread out on the passenger seat. He felt a weight pressing down on him, a crushing realization that he had been part of something far bigger and far darker than he'd ever imagined. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was another text from the unknown number. "You're ready now. Come to the place where it began." Wren's heart sank as he realized what the message meant. There was only one place it could be referring to: the alley where Elijah Grant had lost his life. He put the car in gear, the resolve building in his chest. If Marcus wanted him to see the full truth, Wren was ready to face it. The pieces were falling into place, but Wren knew this was only the beginning. The path ahead was uncertain, the stakes higher than ever. But for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of clarity, a chance to make things right, no matter the cost. The night was heavy with silence as Wren drove toward the address in the text. The city lights faded behind him, replaced by the dim glow of street lamps that lined the outskirts of town. He clenched the steering wheel tightly, his mind replaying everything he had seen and heard. The video, the memo, Marcus's words, it all pointed to one place: the alley where Elijah Grant's life was taken. Wren pulled onto a narrow street, his headlights illuminating crumbling brick walls and graffiti-covered dumpsters. He slowed to a crawl, scanning the area. The alley was just ahead, dark and uninviting. Parking his car at the curb, he stepped out, his boots crunching softly against the pavement. The alley stretched before him, eerily quiet except for the distant hum of the city. The walls bore decades of grime, and the faint stench of stale trash lingered in the air. Wren took a deep breath and stepped forward, his eyes darting to every shadow. Midway through the alley, he stopped. His foot had landed on something hard and metallic. Looking down, he saw a small flashlight lying on the ground, its beam faintly illuminating a piece of paper tucked beneath it. Wren crouched down and picked it up. The paper was another photograph. It showed Elijah Grant standing with a group of young boys, all smiling broadly. In bold letters across the bottom, it read, "Mentor, teacher, brother." Wren's throat tightened as he stared at the image, the humanity of the man he had only known as a name sinking in deeper. "I thought you might not show up." Wren jerked his head up, his hand instinctively going to his hip where his weapon would normally rest. Instead, he was met with the sight of Marcus Grant, leaning casually against the wall at the end of the alley. The dim light cast shadows across his face, but his calm expression was unmistakable. "How long have you been planning this?" Wren demanded, his voice cutting through the stillness. Marcus pushed off the wall and walked slowly toward him, his movements deliberate. "Long enough," he said. "But this isn't about me, Officer Wren. It's about you." Wren straightened, his eyes narrowing. "You've dragged me through hell, made me question everything I've ever known. Why? Just to prove a point." Marcus stopped a few feet away, his gaze steady. "To make you see what you've been blind to. This alley. This is where it began for me. Where I stopped believing in justice as something the system provides and started seeing it as something you have to fight for." He gestured to the walls around them. "This is where my brother died. A teacher, a mentor, a man who had never been in trouble a day in his life. Gunned down because someone felt threatened by his existence. And the man who covered it all up? Your captain." Wren's jaw tightened. "You think I didn't know the system had flaws? I've seen it firsthand. But what makes you think I can change anything? Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying him. Because you're not like them. You followed this far, even when it meant questioning everything you stand for. That takes more courage than you realize. Ren shook his head, his frustration boiling over. You don't know me. You don't know the choices I've made, the things I've done. I know enough, Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. I know you've been complicit, but I also know you're here, right now, trying to understand. That's more than most people in your position would ever do. Ren looked away, his gaze falling to the photograph in his hand. The smiling faces of Elijah and the boys stared back at him, a stark contrast to the grim reality of what had happened here. So what now? Ren asked, his voice quieter. Marcus took a step closer, his tone softening. Now you decide. You've seen the truth. You know what's at stake. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Ren didn't respond immediately. He felt the weight of the choice pressing down on him. To take action meant risking everything. His career, his reputation, his safety. But to walk away meant living with the knowledge that he had done nothing when he had the chance to make a difference. After a long silence, he met Marcus's gaze. What do you need me to do? Marcus's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. There's a file. Evidence that ties Barrett to the cover-up. It's locked away in a precinct archive, marked as inaccessible. You have access. I don't. Ren nodded slowly. And if I get it, then what? Then the world sees the truth, Marcus said simply. And the people who thought they were untouchable learn that no one is above accountability. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Ren glanced at the photograph one last time before tucking it into his jacket. He turned to leave, his step steady, his resolve growing with every step. Marcus watched him go, his expression unreadable. He leaned back against the wall, exhaling deeply. The first domino had fallen. The rest would follow soon enough. The precinct loomed in the early morning light, its stone facade cold and imposing. Ren sat in his car across the street, staring at the entrance. The weight of Marcus's words lingered in his mind. Then the world sees the truth. He had spent the night wrestling with his decision. If he went through with this, there would be no turning back. It wasn't just his career on the line, it was his life as he knew it. But the image of Elijah Grant smiling with those kids haunted him, a reminder of the human cost of inaction. Ren took a deep breath and stepped out of his car. His boots hit the pavement with purpose as he approached the building. Despite his suspension, he still had his keycard and clearance codes, at least for now. His hand trembled slightly as he swiped the card at the employee entrance. The light blinked green, and the lock clicked open. Inside, the precinct was quiet, the usual buzz of activity replaced by the stillness of dawn. A few officers milled about, their tired faces betraying the end of a long shift. Ren kept his head down, avoiding eye contact as he made his way toward the records department. The records room was buried deep in the heart of the precinct, its thick metal door guarded by a biometric scanner. Ren stopped in front of it, his heart pounding. He knew the risks. Security logs would track his every move, and if anyone caught him here, there would be no explaining it away. He placed his hand on the scanner, holding his breath as the machine beeped and the door unlocked with a heavy click. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was a maze of filing cabinets and computer terminals, the air thick with the scent of paper and dust. Ren moved quickly, his eyes scanning the labels on the cabinets. He knew what he was looking for, the archives marked as restricted, the files no one was supposed to see. At the far end of the room, a red-tagged cabinet caught his attention. He pulled open the drawer, his fingers trembling as he flipped through the folders. Most of the labels were meaningless to him, until one caught his eye. Grant, Elijah. Case file number 5471. Ren pulled the folder from the drawer and set it on a nearby desk. The file was thicker than he expected, and as he opened it, the scope of the cover-up became horrifyingly clear. Reports had been altered, witness statements redacted, and key evidence lost. The lead investigator's notes were heavily redacted, but Ren could still make out enough to know that Barrett's name appeared multiple times, always in connection with orders to suppress information. There was even a memo suggesting that Barrett had approved the destruction of body cam footage. Wren's stomach churned. He had suspected corruption, but this was worse than he imagined. He pulled out his phone and began snapping photos of the documents, his fingers moving quickly. He didn't have much time. As Wren worked, the door to the records room creaked open. His heart stopped as he looked up to see Captain Barrett standing in the doorway, his face a mask of cold fury. "What the hell are you doing, Wren?" Barrett demanded, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. Wren straightened, his mind racing. "You know exactly what I'm doing, Captain." Barrett's eyes flicked to the open file on the desk, and his jaw tightened. "You've crossed the line. Whatever you think you're doing, it ends here." Wren took a step back, his phone still clutched in his hand. "You buried this, didn't you? You let those officers walk away after killing an innocent man, and then you destroyed the evidence." Barrett's lips curled into a sneer. "You have no idea what you're talking about. You think this is about one case? One mistake? It's bigger than that. You don't get to question the system you're a part of, Wren." Wren shook his head, anger surging through him. "No, Captain. You don't get to decide who gets justice and who doesn't. Elijah Grant deserved better. His family deserved better." Barrett took another step forward, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You're going to regret this. Hand over the phone, Wren. Now." Wren hesitated, his mind racing. He knew Barrett wouldn't let him leave with the photos, but he also knew he couldn't stop now. Steeling himself, he pressed a button on his phone, and a notification popped up, "Upload complete." Barrett's eyes widened as he realized what had just happened. "What did you do?" Wren held his ground, his voice steady. "I sent it to someone who can make sure the truth comes out." "It's over, Barrett." The captain lunged toward him, but Wren sidestepped, grabbing the folder as he bolted for the door. Barrett shouted after him, but Wren didn't stop. He sprinted through the precinct, his adrenaline drowning out the sound of pounding footsteps behind him. Outside, Wren dove into his car and started the engine. As he sped away, he glanced in his rearview mirror to see Barrett standing in the doorway, his face twisted in rage. Wren's hands gripped the wheel tightly as he drove. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. There was no turning back now. Miles away, Marcus's phone buzzed. He picked it up and smiled faintly as he read the message. "It's done. They have it." The morning news broke like a thunderclap, spreading across every major outlet and social media platform. Headlines blared, "Evidence reveals police cover up an Elijah Grant case," "Captain Barrett implicated in decade-long corruption scandal," and "FBI agents fight for justice exposes deep rot in law enforcement." Images of the leaked files, redacted reports, and damning memos filled screens everywhere. The video of Marcus's traffic stop resurfaced alongside the new revelations, drawing connections that no one could ignore. The system that had protected Barrett and his officers for years was now crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. At the precinct, chaos reigned. Reporters swarmed the building, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward as officers tried to shield their faces. Inside, Captain Barrett sat in his office, his face pale and his eyes hollow. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls from officials, lawyers, and reporters he had no intention of answering. The door burst open, and two men in suits entered. Their badges gleamed under the fluorescent lights, FBI agents. "Captain Joseph Barrett," one of them said, his tone cold. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Barrett didn't resist. He simply leaned back in his chair, his hands trembling slightly as the cuffs clicked into place. The weight of his years of deception had finally caught up to him. In a quiet neighborhood, Marcus sat on the front steps of a modest house, watching as the sun climbed higher in the sky. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. It was a news alert about Barrett's arrest. He smiled faintly, though the victory felt bittersweet. Agent Rourke approached, holding a coffee in each hand. She handed one to Marcus and sat down beside him. "You did it," she said, taking a sip. Marcus shook his head. "We did it. And it's not over yet. This is just the beginning." Rourke nodded, understanding. It always is. But you've made a dent. A big one. People are paying attention now. Marcus exhaled deeply, the weight on his shoulders lifting slightly. That's all I ever wanted. Across town, Ren sat alone in his apartment, staring at his phone. He had avoided the news all morning, but the notifications piling up made it impossible to ignore. Articles, videos, and comments flooded his screen, dissecting every detail of the case. He rubbed his face, exhaustion and relief washing over him. He had taken the biggest risk of his life, and it had paid off. But the cost wasn't lost on him. His career, his reputation, and his former sense of certainty were all gone. What remained was a man who had seen the system for what it truly was and had chosen to fight back. A knock at the door startled him. Ren stood and opened it to find Marcus standing on the other side, his expression calm but resolute. "You're not here to thank me, are you?" Ren asked with a weak smile. Marcus shook his head. "No. I'm here to remind you that this isn't the end. You've taken a step most people wouldn't, but it's just a step. The fight isn't over." Ren sighed, leaning against the doorframe. "What do you want from me, Marcus?" "I want you to decide what kind of man you're going to be," Marcus said simply. "You've seen the truth. Now it's up to you to keep pushing for it." Ren nodded slowly, understanding. "I'll do my part." "Good," Marcus said, extending a hand. Ren shook it firmly, the gesture carrying more weight than either of them said aloud. Weeks later, the fallout continued. Barrett's arrest sparked a nationwide conversation about accountability in law enforcement. Protests and rallies demanded systemic reform, while investigative reports uncovered more cases of misconduct tied to Barrett and his network. Ren, now a former officer, became a quiet advocate for change. He shared his story with reporters and community leaders, offering a rare glimpse into the inner workings of a corrupt system. Though he struggled with the stigma of his past, he found a sense of purpose in helping others understand the need for reform. Marcus, meanwhile, returned to his work within the FBI. Though he kept a low profile, his impact was undeniable. The video of his traffic stop, combined with the revelations he had orchestrated, became a symbol of resilience and justice. Communities rallied around his story, using it as a rallying cry for change. I ask you to please comment on your impressions and opinions in the comments. I would feel very happy if you leave me a like.